At exactly 22 minutes past the hour, in the freezing skies above hostile Europe, a young American pilot found himself trapped inside a flying metal coffin. The massive radial engine of his fighter roared with a deafening mechanical scream as he desperately tried to scan the empty horizon for any signs of friendly aircraft. He knew that straggling behind the main formation in this brutal theater of war was practically an absolute death sentence. Elite enemy fighter wings were constantly prowling the skies just above him, waiting for the perfect moment to execute a ruthless ambush on any isolated target. The air temperature at 20,000 feet was violently cold, creeping into the cockpit and chilling the pilot to his very bones despite his heavy leather gear. His oxygen mask felt terribly heavy against his face, while his heart hammered a relentless rhythm against his ribs in the silent anticipation of an impending attack. He was flying the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, an aircraft that was affectionately known to its pilots as the Jug because of its massive and ungraceful proportions. At that exact moment, the pilot had no idea that the brilliant engineering hidden beneath the aluminum skin of his ugly fighter was about to be tested beyond all known limits of aviation physics. Without any warning whatsoever, the peaceful blue sky above him shattered into a chaotic nightmare of tracer fire and screaming engines. A massive pack of German Focke-Wulf 190 fighters dropped from the blinding sun, perfectly executing a coordinated bounce that caught the American squadron completely by surprise. The enemy pilots were seasoned veterans who operated their nimble aircraft with terrifying precision, slicing through the American formation and scattering the heavy thunderbolts in every possible direction. Before the young American pilot could even push his throttle to emergency military power, the explosive shells were already tearing into the vulnerable tail section of his aircraft. The sound of 20-millimeter cannon shells impacting the aluminum fuselage was not like the sharp crack of standard bullets, but rather a series of catastrophic, deafening explosions. Each hit violently shook the massive 7-ton aircraft, tossing the pilot around his cramped cockpit like a rag doll inside a falling metal barrel. Hot shrapnel and jagged pieces of torn aluminum violently zipped through the cockpit, severing crucial hydraulic lines and destroying vital flight instruments in fractions of a second. The situation went from dangerous to absolutely catastrophic when a direct cannon hit completely shattered his canopy, sending razor-sharp shards of plexiglass raining down onto his helmet and flight suit. A terrifying mixture of atomized hydraulic fluid and thick black engine oil immediately sprayed across his forward windshield, completely blinding him to the outside world. He desperately tried to wipe the freezing sludge away with his heavily gloved hand, but it only smeared the thick chemical paste further across the ruined glass. He was flying completely blind at nearly 400 miles per hour over heavily defended enemy territory, with an aircraft that was rapidly disintegrating around him. The thick smoke filling the cockpit was choking him with the toxic smell of burning rubber and scorched electrical wire, forcing him to make a desperate decision. He reached down to unlatch his safety harness, firmly deciding that it was finally time to abandon the doomed aircraft and take his chances with a parachute in enemy territory. He grabbed the emergency canopy release handle and pulled it with all of his remaining strength, expecting the shattered roof to instantly fly away into the violent slipstream. Instead, nothing happened at all, because the explosive impact of the enemy cannon shells had severely warped the heavy metal rails that held the canopy securely in place. He was completely trapped inside a burning, blinding, and uncontrollable machine that was rapidly descending toward the unforgiving landscape of occupied France. Panic is a natural human reaction when faced with absolute certainty of death, but the intense military training of the young pilot forced his brain into a state of cold calculation. Since he could not escape the ruined cockpit, his only remaining option was to somehow force this completely shattered piece of American engineering to fly all the way back to the English coast. He firmly grabbed the control stick with both hands and pushed hard on the heavy rudder pedals, desperately trying to feel how much aerodynamic authority the dying aircraft still possessed. Miraculously, the massive control surfaces responded to his physical inputs, proving that the thick steel cables connecting the stick to the tail were somehow still intact. The secret to his immediate survival lay deep within the nose of the aircraft, where the legendary Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine was performing an absolute mechanical miracle. This gigantic 18-cylinder radial power plant was practically the size of a small car, and it was designed with tolerances that seemed almost completely absurd to European aviation engineers. Despite having multiple cylinders completely blown away by explosive enemy cannon fire, the massive beast simply refused to stop turning its heavy, four-bladed propeller. It violently shook the entire airframe and spewed thick rivers of burning oil into the freezing wind, but it continued to drag the dying Thunderbolt forward through sheer brute force. Suddenly, a terrifying shadow fell over his battered cockpit, temporarily blocking the bright sunlight that was desperately trying to filter through the oil-smeared windshield. He aggressively kicked his heavy rudder pedal to twist the dying plane sideways, managing to catch a fleeting glimpse of the danger through a shattered hole in his canopy glass. A pristine German Focke-Wulf 190 fighter was perfectly positioned just a few hundred yards behind his shredded tail, casually matching his speed with terrifying ease. The pilot sitting in that enemy fighter was an elite German ace who had already sent dozens of Allied aircraft to a fiery grave, and he was now calmly preparing to claim his next victim. The German ace carefully adjusted his throttle and perfectly aligned his glowing, illuminated gun sight with the smoking, battered wreckage of the American Thunderbolt. He could clearly see the massive, jagged holes in the wings, the heavy black smoke pouring from the crippled engine, and the completely ruined canopy trapping the desperate pilot inside. In the cruel mathematics of aerial warfare, this was essentially a free kill that required no difficult maneuvering and posed absolutely no threat to the experienced hunter. The ace smoothly squeezed the firing trigger on his control stick, unleashing a devastating storm of high-explosive Menengeschoss ammunition directly at the helpless American plane. These specialized German cannon shells were not solid pieces of metal, but rather thin-walled explosive devices designed to detonate violently against the fragile aluminum skin of enemy aircraft. A single well-placed shell could effortlessly rip the entire wing off a British Spitfire, or completely disintegrate the tail section of an American Mustang in the blink of an eye. The ace watched with cold professional satisfaction as a terrifying line of bright explosions marched directly up the fuselage of the American fighter, striking the cockpit area repeatedly. Any normal aircraft subjected to such a concentrated level of explosive punishment would have instantly transformed into a terrifying fireball of burning aviation fuel and shattered metal. But the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was fundamentally different from any other fighter plane ever constructed during the entirety of the Second World War. When American engineers originally designed the Jug, they inherently understood that its massive size would make it an easy target, so they compensated by building it like a flying, heavily armored tank. The pilot was sitting inside a protective bathtub of thick armor plating that wrapped entirely around his seat, specifically designed to stop heavy-caliber machine gun bullets and shrapnel. The thunderous impacts of the German 20mm shells violently shook the American pilot inside his seat, but the hardened, heavy steel plate behind his head miraculously held its ground. The deafening noise inside the crippled American fighter was absolutely unimaginable, as explosive shells continuously detonated against the thick armor plate right behind the pilot's skull. He was being violently thrown aggressively against his restrictive seatbelts, while the entire instrument panel in front of his face completely shattered into a million useless pieces of flying debris. Despite being blinded by the thick engine oil and practically deafened by the relentless explosions, he instinctively shoved his control stick forward and violently stomped on the rudder pedals. The massive, smoking 7-ton aircraft violently skidded sideways through the freezing air, desperately throwing off the German pilot's carefully calculated aiming solution just enough to survive the pass. The German ace quickly pulled his nimble fighter upward, completely expecting to see the heavily damaged American aircraft finally spiral down into a chaotic, fiery death. Instead, he stared in absolute shock as the ruined Thunderbolt violently snapped back into a level flying attitude and stubbornly continued its slow, agonizing crawl toward the distant English Channel. The fuselage of the American plane looked like it had been systematically chewed apart by a mechanical monster, with entire sections of the outer aluminum skin completely missing. Yet somehow, the shattered Pratt & Whitney engine was still violently clawing at the thin air, refusing to surrender to the catastrophic damage inflicted upon it. The seasoned German hunter was deeply confused by this impossible display of mechanical resilience, so he aggressively banked his fighter around to initiate a second deadly firing pass. He coldly calculated the approach angle to completely avoid the thick armor plate behind the pilot, aiming his deadly cannons directly at the vulnerable wing roots where the volatile fuel tanks were located. He closed the distance rapidly, bringing his fighter so incredibly close to the American plane that he could clearly see the terrified eyes of his helpless enemy through the shattered glass. Once again, the ace firmly squeezed the firing trigger, sending a continuous, terrifying stream of explosive shells and heavy machine gun bullets ripping straight into the thick wings of the Thunderbolt. The American pilot felt the catastrophic impacts tearing through his fragile wings, fully expecting the massive aviation fuel tanks hidden inside to violently detonate into a blinding fireball. What the German ace did not realize was that American engineers had heavily wrapped those internal fuel tanks in thick layers of self-sealing raw rubber compounds. As the burning shrapnel violently pierced the heavy metal tanks, the specialized rubber reacted instantly with the leaking aviation fuel, dramatically swelling up to plug the massive bullet holes. The devastating explosive shells destroyed internal wing ribs and severed multiple secondary control cables, but the catastrophic fire that the German pilot was expecting simply never materialized. Inside the smoke-filled cockpit, the American pilot was physically exhausted, heavily bleeding from multiple shrapnel wounds, and struggling to breathe without his shattered oxygen system. He could feel the heavy flight controls becoming incredibly stiff and completely unresponsive as the last remaining drops of crucial hydraulic fluid slowly bled out into the freezing atmosphere. He aggressively pushed the heavy throttle lever all the way forward to the absolute mechanical stop, demanding everything the crippled engine could possibly give him. The massive 18-cylinder radial violently shuddered in protest, spitting large, jagged chunks of broken metal out of its exhaust pipes, but the incredible speed of the aircraft actually increased slightly. The German ace broke off his second aggressive attack run, circling high above the heavily damaged American aircraft with a profound sense of tactical disbelief. He had just poured enough high-explosive ammunition into that single aircraft to completely destroy an entire squadron of heavy four-engine bombers, yet the stubborn machine simply refused to fall. His ammunition counters were completely empty, meaning he had fired his entire combat load of 20mm cannon shells and heavy machine gun rounds at this single stubborn target. He possessed absolutely no weapons left to finish the gruesome job, but his sheer morbid curiosity forced him to fly down and inspect this impossible mechanical miracle up close. The American pilot flinched violently as a dark shadow suddenly appeared right next to his shattered cockpit, fully expecting the devastating final blow to end his miserable life. He slowly turned his heavily bruised head and was absolutely shocked to see the pristine German Focke-Wulf 190 flying in perfect tight formation, mere feet away from his ruined wing. The two sworn enemies stared deeply at each other across the narrow gap of freezing, rushing air, locked in a surreal moment of intimate human connection amidst a brutal global war. The German aircraft was a beautiful, sleek instrument of aerial death, while the American machine was a heavily smoking, shattered ruin that defied all known laws of aerodynamics. The ace closely inspected the catastrophic damage inflicted upon the Thunderbolt, his experienced eyes scanning the hundreds of jagged bullet holes and completely missing sections of vital flight control surfaces. He saw the thick, heavy oil streaming fiercely across the shattered canopy, and he saw the heavily bleeding, desperate American pilot aggressively fighting the heavy controls just to keep the plane level. In that fleeting, silent moment, the veteran German pilot realized that he was no longer looking at an enemy combatant, but rather a fellow aviator engaged in the legendary struggle for survival. The brutal arithmetic of war temporarily faded away, replaced by a profound sense of overwhelming professional respect for the sheer, unbreakable willpower of both the man and his machine. Slowly and deliberately, the German ace raised his heavy, leather-gloved hand to the edge of his flight helmet, executing a crisp and deeply respectful military salute to his defeated but unbroken enemy. He gently rocked the wings of his sleek fighter back and forth in a universal aviation gesture of ultimate respect, bidding farewell to the most resilient opponent he had ever encountered. The American pilot, completely paralyzed by a profound mixture of shock and sheer exhaustion, could only offer a weak, trembling nod in return before the enemy fighter smoothly peeled away into the clouds. He was finally entirely alone in the freezing sky, but his desperate battle for survival was still incredibly far from reaching a peaceful conclusion. The battered Thunderbolt was rapidly losing critical altitude as the violently shaking engine finally began to consume itself from the inside out due to total oil starvation. The freezing waters of the English Channel were rapidly approaching below him, presenting a terrifying new obstacle that claimed the lives of countless pilots whose engines failed over the open sea. He had to maintain a precise, agonizing balance between keeping the nose up to avoid crashing and keeping the nose down to maintain enough forward speed to keep the heavy plane flying. Every slight movement of the heavy control stick required massive physical effort, forcing the wounded pilot to use both of his arms and all of his remaining strength just to stay airborne. As the jagged coastline of friendly England finally appeared faintly through the thick haze, a new wave of absolute terror suddenly washed over the exhausted American pilot. He was approaching a friendly military airfield, but his windshield was still completely coated in thick black engine oil, rendering him practically blind to the rapidly approaching runway. He had to aggressively fly the heavily damaged aircraft sideways, nervously looking out through the small shattered hole in his canopy just to see the green ground rushing up to meet him. Without any functional hydraulics, he was completely forced to manually crank the heavy landing gear down using a small hand wheel, a physically agonizing task that drained his last remaining ounce of energy. The heavy steel landing gear violently locked into place with a terrifying metallic thud just seconds before the massive, crippled fighter slammed incredibly hard onto the solid concrete runway. The shredded tires aggressively screamed against the pavement as the heavy aircraft violently swerved left and right, completely ignoring the pilot's desperate attempts to maintain a straight rollout. The burning, violently shaking engine finally seized completely with a catastrophic mechanical scream, bringing the heavy, shattered metal beast to an abrupt and completely silent halt on the edge of the grass. Emergency fire trucks and screaming medical ambulances frantically rushed across the wide airfield, fully expecting to pull a dead body out of the heavily smoking, completely unrecognizable wreckage. When the shocked ground crews finally managed to pry the warped canopy open, they found the young American pilot completely drenched in thick oil, heavily bleeding, but incredibly still breathing. As the exhausted pilot was carefully carried away on a soft medical stretcher, the experienced aviation mechanics stood around the ruined aircraft in a state of absolute, reverent silence. They meticulously counted an impossible 21 direct hits from high-explosive 20mm cannon shells, along with over 200 individual holes from heavy machine gun bullets, completely tearing through the aluminum skin. By all known laws of physics, aerodynamics, and mechanical engineering, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt sitting before them should have violently disintegrated into a million pieces over the hostile fields of occupied Europe. Instead, this incredibly stubborn machine successfully protected its vulnerable pilot and safely brought him all the way back home through sheer, unyielding structural integrity. This legendary encounter fundamentally changed how military engineers approach the intricate design of protective armor and aircraft survivability in aggressive combat scenarios. The young pilot eventually returned to the hostile skies and became a highly decorated ace himself, but he never forgot the haunting image of the German fighter gently flying off his shattered wing. The brutal, unforgiving skies of the Second World War witnessed countless terrifying tragedies, but on that particular day, a miraculous masterpiece of American engineering simply refused to let its pilot die. If you found this incredible story of aviation survival absolutely fascinating, you must watch our detailed breakdown of how a heavily damaged B-17 bomber landed without its entire tail section. Thank you so much for watching this video, and we will definitely see you in the next deep dive into military aviation history. Stay safe out there, and never underestimate the sheer willpower of a pilot fighting for his life. Do not forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more incredible historical content.